Well, good evening, folks, and welcome to our Tuesday night home Bible study. Tonight, we will be looking at Genesis chapter 40. We are just getting started good in the Joseph novella that began in chapter 37, and then there was a little hiatus in chapter 38 after Judah had come up with the scheme to sell Joseph to the traders that were going to Egypt, and so chapter 38 gave us a window into the rascal of Judah, and we'll see. And it's important that we had this picture of Judah and his indiscretions and etc. And because Judah will make a change in his ways before the story of Joseph is over. Joseph has been taken to Egypt, sold to Potiphar, who is, at the end of chapter 37, is called the captain of Pharaoh's guard, and is a prominent officer. Pharaoh, captain of the guard. Joseph served a while in Potiphar's house and proved to be so reliable and so blessed of the Lord that he ended up running the household, which Joseph probably doesn't realize this, but that's preparation. Learning to run all the affairs of a large and wealthy household is preparing him later on when he will be running the affairs of Egypt. And Potiphar's wife, Potiphar's gone a lot with his big government job. Potiphar's wife wanted to have an affair with Joseph. He refused, and she, told Potiphar that he had tried to molest her, and Joseph has been thrown into the prison. It's a special prison where the king's prisoners are kept, and Joseph ends up running things in the prison, and when the keeper of the prison wants anything to be done, Joseph is the one that ends up being the heading it up. Also, it's not absolutely clear, but it is strongly implied that the keeper of the prison is none other than Potiphar himself, and we'll see a few little evidences of that tonight as we read chapter 40. So Joseph's in the prison. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended. The Hebrew word is chata, which is the word for sin. They had sinned against their Lord. They had missed the mark of his expectations. They had offended their Lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth or angry with two of his officers against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. Notice it repeats this and is very, wants to make really clear their positions and who they are. And he put them in ward or in prison in the house of the captain of the guard. And that's the title that Potiphar has, last verse in chapter 37. Into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard, Potiphar, charged Joseph with them, and he served them. And they continued a season in ward or in prison. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt. Notice how it emphasizes who they are again, who were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad, or it could even be rendered, they were troubled. And he asked Potiphar's officers who were with him in the prison of his Lord's house, of Potiphar's house, saying, Wherefore look you so sad or troubled today? And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph, and said unto him, In my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, And it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head. Now, before we move any further, that phrase, lift up thine head, is going to appear 3 different ways in the verses that follow. Here it means to restore you back to your place, or to honor you. He'll lift up your head and restore you unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner when thou wast his butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews. That's not exactly what happened, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon, or the pit. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket there were all manner of baked meats or foods, dainties, for Pharaoh. And the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee. Not good. And shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. That is, he honored, put them in positions of honor at the feast. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again. And he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. Well, Joseph in the prison. We're not told, and we don't know how much time has passed since Joseph was put into prison. It was long enough from the time he was put in prison there in verse 20 of the previous chapter that, there's only 4 more verses, but it was long enough time for him to become prominent in the prison and to be the one that was in charge of whatever got done. Of course, he did have a little head start with that, if, as it seems pretty clear, that Potiphar is very closely connected with the prison there. The keeper of the prison, back in verse 22 and 23 of chapter 39, might not be Potiphar, but it's pretty obvious that the captain of the guard, verse 4 in this chapter, verse 3 and verse 4, that's the same title that was given to Potiphar the first time he was mentioned in the last verse of chapter 37. And when we're told that Pharaoh's officers, verse 7, were put in prison of his lord or his owner's house, it could even be translated, that sounds like certainly that Potiphar is well connected in there and maybe over that prison. He may be over some other things that Pharaoh has too, but the prison is part of his domain, which again lends a little credence to the thinking that when Potiphar was angered after his wife had accused Joseph falsely, it may have been that Potiphar saw through that accusation that she had made and is doing this to protect Joseph by putting him in that prison where he'll still be able to serve Potiphar and to, maybe not be in the worst of the prisons. Anyway, we don't really, those are things that we don't really know. They're not really that important as far as the progression of the story. But anyway, Joseph is in the prison, and he has a prominent place in the prison, and we have two important people who are now placed into the prison there in the first verse. These are people who are part of the cabinet, as it were, of Pharaoh. And we're told that the chief butler and the chief baker. Now, the term that is translated chief butler is the same term that over in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 11 is used of Nehemiah, who was the king's cupbearer. And in the dream that this butler has, it's obvious that his duties include being the cupbearer to the king. Now, the cupbearer, or the butler, as it's translated here, but the word is really refers to one who hands the cup to the king. Also, he's the wine taster and food tester for the king. Both of these positions had to do with the king's food. You have the chief baker, you have the chief, the wine taster and the cupbearer. These are people who would have perhaps access to a way to poison Pharaoh. And presumably what has happened here is that Pharaoh suspects one or both of them of trying to poison him. In ancient times, when the kings had absolute power, they had to surround themselves with people that were trustworthy, and they also had to enforce the trustworthiness of people with sheer force and fear. And presumably Pharaoh considers that these two men, or maybe one or both, have no longer can he trust them, and that maybe they have tried to poison him. Perhaps there was something that he was given to eat that didn't taste just right to him when he got it. And be that as it may, both of these guys are put into the prison, and they have fallen from favor with Pharaoh. When it says that they had offended their Lord, that's the Hebrew word that's translated sin in the Old Testament, chata, which means to shoot a bow and arrow at a target and miss. They have missed the mark with their master, and they have fallen from his graces, and he no longer has trust in them. They puts them into prison to keep them secure while they do the investigation to see what kind of mischief they've been up to. So they are in the prison, and obviously they're not happy to be there. Joseph's not happy to be there. Nobody wants to be in prison. And so they have come into the prison, prominent prisoners, and they're put into prison in the house of the captain of the guard. So it's obviously is connected with Potiphar's house some way. And it's the place where Joseph's bound, and so he puts Joseph in charge of them, and we're told that Joseph served them. Same word that's used back in chapter 39, verse 4, when Joseph was bought by Potiphar. He found grace in Potiphar's sight and served him. Joseph has a servant's heart. He has a servant attitude, and he has decided, well, when he was a slave, he decided he was going to make the best of that and do the very best that he could and try to be successful. In fact, the whole theme of the previous chapter was that Joseph was a successful or prosperous man, and everything he did, the Lord made it prosper. Well, now he's in the prison, which, Joseph's had a couple of dreams of his own about being prominent and about his brothers bowing down to him, their sheaves bowing down, and the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down to him. And so far, it seems to be anything but. He has been sold, had the coat of many colors stripped off of him by his brothers. They've stripped him of everything. He no longer is even a free person. He was made a slave, and there's only one step down the social ladder from slavery, and that's to be a convict, and that's where he is now. But Joseph still is going to do the best that he can. It's just amazing that the Lord, being with Joseph, has given him that kind of servant perspective. And I'll tell you, when the Lord is with you and you live your life in the presence of God, and you know, and He is the guiding force of your life, it'll give you a servant attitude. It produces those kinds of qualities, and it did with Joseph. Well, so Joseph gets to know them. He is there with them, and he's doing what he can to help make their stay more comfortable. And, of course, he knows that they are prominent people. And Joseph also doesn't want to stay in the prison any longer than he has to. Well, on a particular night, these two men each dream a dream. Interesting. Joseph knows something about dreams. In fact, in all the book of Genesis, there's only just a time or two prior to this. There's a dream that Jacob had out at Bethel when he saw the angels going up and down the ladder. That's a dream. Abimelech, the king of Gerar, has a dream when the Lord warns him against taking Sarah, who is Pharaoh, who is Abraham's wife, and Abraham has lied and said she's my sister because he's afraid that they'll kill him to get her. Same thing he had done before in Egypt, but God in a dream warns Abimelech. There's just a few times in all the book of Genesis that talks about dreams prior to this. But in Joseph's story, there's dream after dream after dream. And the story of Joseph begins with dreams. And he has two dreams that essentially mean the same thing. About the sheaves bowing down to his sheep, and the stars and the sun and moon stars bowing down to him. And Joseph is interested in dreams. He's had some dreams of his own. And I'll tell you, his brothers stripped him of everything else, but they couldn't strip him of his dreams. So here are these two guys, the chief butler, the cupbearer, as it were, and the baker, who is over cooking the food for Pharaoh. And they each have a dream in the same night. Now, it reads kind of rough, verse 5. The King James says, each man according to the interpretation of his dream. The idea there, and the Hebrew is kind of rough, but the gist of that is that each man had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. And but they don't know what the dreams mean, because the next morning Joseph comes in, probably to bring them breakfast. I don't know if he's bringing them breakfast in bed, whatever. He's doing what he can do for them. Joseph, is pretty shrewd, and he knows that these guys came from Pharaoh's court. And he also knows that if he is going to, get out of prison, it's probably going to take an act of God, maybe, and an act of Pharaoh too, if you know what I mean. And so he is making sure that he, pays attention to them, and he notices that they're troubled or they're worried. King James says sad. They're disturbed. And I don't know if you've ever had a dream that left you disturbed when you woke up, and you just sort of, and that's the way these guys were. And Joseph says, well, what's the matter? And why are you so sad or troubled today? And they say, we've dreamed a dream and there's no interpreter. It's sort of like we're both sick and there's no doctor. We've got, there's nobody here that's a professional dream interpreter. Pharaoh had those professional dream interpreters. They were called the magicians and the wise men. And we'll see that over in the next chapter, we'll encounter them. And the soothsayers and fortune tellers and those kinds of things is what the pagans had. But these two guys are helpless now that they don't have those to consult with. And Joseph, again, part of Joseph's insight just has to do with the fact that he knows the Lord. And he says, do not interpretations belong to God? He'll have that same perspective later on when Pharaoh has a couple of dreams in the next chapter. And one of these guys who gets his job back, the chief butler and baker, he'll then remember, the light will go on in his mind, and he'll remember there was a guy in the prison that helped me with a dream one time, and they send for Joseph. And when Pharaoh wants to know about his dream, Joseph says, the interpretations belong to God, but he will give you an answer of peace from this. So Joseph's perspective is that God is the source of all knowledge, which is that's a pretty good insight to have. And I'll tell you, if you have that kind of, that's a good starting place for understanding about life, just to know that the source of all truth is God. And that's essentially where Joseph is coming from. So he says, tell me your dreams. And he doesn't say, I'm going to interpret your dream. He just says, interpretations belong to God. Tell me what you dreamed. And so the chief butler, who, by the way, is the one who is not guilty of, plotting against Pharaoh, he has no qualms about sharing his dream. And so he tells his dream. There was a vine. And, of course, he's the cupbearer, and he presses the grapes into the Pharaoh's cup, and he serves Pharaoh the wine, and he tastes it and all of this before Pharaoh would get it. But he's doing his job, and his dream was related to his work. And the vine had 3 branches, and he says, and the branches produced ripe grapes, and I pressed them, squeezed them into the cup, and gave the cup to Pharaoh. And Joseph said, well, here's sounds like a pretty simple dream. The 3 branches are 3 days, and in 3 days you'll be pressing the grapes into the cup and giving Pharaoh his cup again, and you'll get your job back. And then he says in verse 14, but think on me or remember me when it will be well with you. And then he says, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me. The word translated kindness is a very important Old Testament word. It's the Hebrew word chesed that later on is used almost exclusively for God's steadfast covenant love that he has for Israel, that will not let them go. And the idea of chesed is not just kindness, but it is a kindness in a covenant context. And so really what Joseph is doing, he's not asking, for the butler to do him a favor. He's asking the butler to remember a covenant. He's asking the butler, let's make a deal. This is a bargain that we're making. I've told you the meaning of the dream. When it comes true, then your side of this is to remember me to Pharaoh and bring me out of this house. And then he goes on and says, for indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews. I don't believe that Joseph is trying to gloss over anything here. He just doesn't want to go there about that. For one thing, Joseph does not demonstrate any kind of hostility or ill will or grudge bearing toward his brothers or toward Potiphar's wife for that matter. Joseph seems to be bent on trying to forget all that. Joseph doesn't want to go there and say, yeah, my old brother sold me as a slave. And of course, then he would have opened a can of worms, and the chief butler would have been thinking, well, I wonder what Joseph was doing that made them want to sell their own brother as a slave. Maybe something wrong with this guy. Joseph just doesn't go there, doesn't open any of those cans of worms that could have been opened. He's a pretty smart boy. He's got a lot of insight. He's pretty, he's with it upstairs. So he just says, I was stolen away and out of the land of the Hebrews. I'm not from around here. I'm from, over in the land of Canaan, which is hundreds of miles away. And after I've gotten here, I've done nothing to be put into the dungeon or the pit. I might have even said that when I was reading the text. It's interesting. The same word that's translated dungeon here is the same word that was used for the pit over in chapter 37 that his brothers threw him in while they were eating their lunch, and then the caravan came by and they decided to sell him. Either one of those pits, Joseph didn't do anything to be put in there. And part of his time, at least in this part of the story, is he's being thrown into one pit after another. Well, the interpretation of the chief baker, the cupbearer's dream, is pretty positive. And so that encourages the chief baker, who obviously must have been the guilty one here, or at least Pharaoh thinks so later in the story. So the chief baker sees that the interpretation is good, and that encourages him to share his dream too. Perhaps because of his guilt, because he knew he'd been doing things wrong, he was afraid to tell anything much about his thinking and about his thoughts, because maybe guilt was overwhelming him already. But anyway, he saw it was a good interpretation, and it sounded pretty positive, and so he goes on and tells his dream. Had 3 baskets, one on top of the other, on my head, and had all these dainties, all these little sweetmeats and things that were in the baskets. I have read that scholars have identified at least 57 different kinds of bread and 38 different varieties of cakes that were part of the regular fare at Pharaoh's table. And so, lots of different things in that top basket. But as he's carrying those baskets, the birds come and light on the basket and start eating the things that are in the top basket and destroying them. And Joseph says, well, here's what this dream means. You got 3 baskets, that's 3 days. Same number of days as in the previous dream. 3 days, your head will be lifted up in a different way than the other one. Back in verse 13, when he says, Pharaoh will lift up your head, it means I'm going to restore you back to your position, going to give you a place of prominence again. Here he says, 3 days, verse 19, Pharaoh's going to lift your head up off your shoulders, so to speak. Your head won't be on you anymore. And then he'll hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh, or birds in the dream. Now, this sounds a little bit callous when we think about it. Why didn't Joseph, kind of gloss it over a little bit? Well, Joseph is about the truth, and he's honest, and he tells it when the meaning is positive and nice. He gives it that way. When the meaning is harsh and negative, he tells it that way. Just as the prophets in the Old Testament were to give the truth of God and not gloss it over, and if it didn't turn out to be as they said, they were not to be listened to, but they were to be stoned to death, according to Moses. Anyway, Joseph's not really a prophet here, but he is about the truth, and so he tells it good or bad, doesn't gloss it over. You find later on in 1 Samuel, I think it's over about chapter 2, that little Samuel, when the Lord speaks to him in the night, and he first thinks that it is Eli, and he goes in to see what Eli wanted, and about the second or third time, Eli realizes the Lord's speaking to him. And he tells him to go lay down, and if you hear the voice again, say, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." Well, the Lord, when he spoke to Samuel, he had a real message, a humdinger for Eli, and it was negative. And little Samuel went in and told him the whole thing, didn't leave anything out. And so there's a lot to be said for being just truly honest. Again, in our day and time, we want to gloss over oftentimes the realities of life and the realities of death. Again, trying to make it sound nice does not remove the reality. Life is real and death is real. And so Joseph just tells it like it is. Well, 3 days. Guess what? The third day is Pharaoh's birthday. Wow. It may have been that in the preparations for Pharaoh's birthday feast, which would have been going on for some time, Pharaoh, if anybody got a birthday party every year, it would have been Pharaoh. Pharaoh was the king of that part of the world and ruled with an iron hand and was he was had absolute power. And so everybody wanted things to be good for Pharaoh's birthday. And who knows, he might have had 2 or 3 birthdays a year, who knows. Anyway, he was going to have a feast. And at the birthday feast, he lifts up the head of the butler and the baker. That is, he puts them in seats of honor. And it looks like that they're going to be restored back to their positions. Now, the chief butler, the cupbearer, has already been told that he'll be restored. The chief baker, on the other hand, had been told that, your head's going to be lifted up from off of you. And you're going to be hung on a tree and birds are going to eat your flesh. Well, so far it doesn't look like that's coming about. The chief butler is happy because he's being restored back. The chief baker is starting to sort of, nervously smile a little bit because maybe what Joseph said was only partly true. And so the feast proceeds, and Pharaoh makes an announcement, perhaps, that we're glad to have Sebastian back as our chief butler again, and press some grapes into the cup and give me a tankard of wine. And so he gives the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And then Pharaoh maybe turns to the butler, to the baker, and says, time for you to be put to death. Can you imagine the women in the court swooning and the gasp in all the crowd as the chief baker is taken out to be put to death? Everything happened just the way Joseph said. But the chief butler, who's restored to the right side of Pharaoh to be handing him the cup and tasting the wine every time that Pharaoh drinks, tasting the food every time that Pharaoh eats, right there, and has the ear of Pharaoh, he forgets all about Joseph for a time. Now think back for just a moment. What if Joseph had agreed with Potiphar's wife, yes, I'll have an affair with you, and we'll keep it secret from Potiphar, and he went along with her, and they did that, and maybe they got by, and Potiphar never found out. Had Joseph not done the right thing and refused to have the affair with Potiphar's wife, Joseph would have never been in the prison when the butler and baker were there. Wouldn't have been there, would have missed the opportunity to hear and interpret their dreams. And he would have never had the opportunity to stand before Pharaoh in this next chapter that comes up and talk to Pharaoh about Pharaoh's dreams. And interestingly, when Joseph shares the meaning of Pharaoh's dreams. Joseph also has a plan. But none of that would have made any difference if he had not been in the right place at the right time. And he wouldn't have been in the right place at the right time if he had chosen to yield to the temptation that Potiphar's wife had offered him. It always is the right thing to do the right thing. And in the long run, it always pays to do the right thing. People will forget you. I'm sure the chief butler intended to mention to Pharaoh, but forgot to. Well, there's one person that'll never forget you, and that's God. And he remembered each and every one of us when he sent his son into this world to die on the cross and pay for all our sins, so he could raise him from the dead, living proof that we can be put right with God by trusting in Jesus Christ. People will forget you sometimes, but God never does. Have a good night, folks. Talk to you next week.